Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to leave China behind and cross over to the islands of Japan and give just a brief overview of Japanese culture, the development of the Daimyo and the samurai, and the creation of the shogunate before we dive into our first real Japanese era of Japanese history that we're going to be covering in depth, the Tokugawa. So we're just going to give the briefest overview of Japan and the samurai, and then that'll set the stage for tomorrow, where we slow down and dive in a little bit more. So here are your objectives for today. Hopefully you can take a moment and absorb them, and we'll dive into our background narrative. Japanese history describes that says that the gods created Japan, and that the first emperor was descended from the sun god Amaterasu. And so Japan has always had an emperor going back to the legendary first emperor Jimmu. And so this is the Japanese creation story. Take a moment and pause if you're interested in it. But all of the Japanese, what's relevant here is that, quote, Amaterasu bore a son who became the emperor of Japan, and all the emperors since then have claimed descent from him. The Yamato family is the only Japanese imperial royal family, whereas China has all of these competing dynasties with the idea that one dynasty, when it collapses, will be replaced by another and another imperial family. The Japanese only have the single divine imperial family descended in Japanese lore and mythology all the way back to the sun god Amaterasu. So the emperor has legendary beginnings. The first emperor, Jimmu, pictured here, again descended directly from the gods, and then all the entire imperial line since then directly descended from the legendary emperor Jimmu. There's three symbols of imperial power: the mirror, the sword, and the jewel. These are theoretically held by the imperial family and are not viewed by anyone else, demonstrating again the divine role the emperor plays in Japanese history. Originally, the emperor and his court were set up in sort of a Chinese style. Generally, Japan has developed its own culture, but adopts elements of Chinese culture. Because China was so wealthy and powerful, Chinese culture and Chinese ideas flow throughout the rest of East Asia and sort of set the stage for other customs and cultures. And so in the beginning, when the Japanese were first developing their civilization, they modeled it after the Tang dynasty in China. And then over time, of course, they have this sort of complicated relationship with China that we'll be discussing as we go forward in East Asian history. Originally, the Japanese religion was Shinto. Shinto is sort of the traditional Japanese religion. It's kind of an animist, but also kind of a pagan religion. The basic idea of Shinto is that there are spirits that inhabit everything. And these spirits, you provide offerings to them, and then the spirits give you some benefit from all of that. Places that are incredibly important to spirits are generally marked by these torii gates, which you will see throughout Japan, that demonstrate places where shrines or spirits are inhabited. And generally, there's some level of worship there. There's generally some level of worship over these spirits, and it's often involved cleanliness, washing of yourself in a sort of ritual way. And so Shinto is still important to Japanese people today, and is still to some degree practiced, although, again, it has been modified somewhat from its traditional form. So Shinto is traditional Japanese religion, the way of the gods. During the earliest period of Japanese history, or one of the earliest periods, the Heian period, we got the development of these traditional Japanese values. Buddhism had come over from China and had been sort of widely spread, and so the Buddhist concept of mujo, or impermanence, became very important, the idea that all things will change and the only constant in life is change. Miyabi translates to something close to courtliness and proper behavior, and it's sort of an offshoot of Confucianism in that it's very important to understand how to behave properly and how to interact with people based on your social standing. And so we see some elements of Buddhism and some elements of Confucianism. And mono no aware is the idea that it's an appreciation of beauty and sadness, and generally shown by an outpouring of emotion when you see something that triggers this sort of sad, melancholy feeling. And so these traditional values help shape Japanese activity and Japanese culture, and have become very embedded within the Japanese psyche. We see this in traditional Japanese literature, for example, the tales of the Hike. Quote, "The sound of the bells echoes the impermanence of all things. The color of the flowers reveals the truth that the prosperous must decline. The proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The mighty fall at last, and they are as dust before the wind." Seeing both Mono no Oware and also Mujo. During the Heian period, the power of the emperor eventually was lessened, and a powerful clan called the Fujiwara clan rose to prominence. The Fujiwara clan, in Chinese history, of course, they would supplant the Yamato family and take on the role of emperor for themselves. But the Fujiwara clan, especially Fujiwara no Michinaga, the sort of heir or one of the most important Fujiwara rulers, came up with a very clever way of controlling the imperial family through marrying their daughters to the emperors. And then the power would be held by the older sort of Fujiwara, the leader of the Fujiwara clan. And they would generally keep the emperors relatively young. And so as the young emperor was then married to or betrothed to one of the Fujiwara daughters, the father of the Fujiwara clan would hold the actual power, and then when the emperor came of age, he would generally be forced to retire and be replaced by a younger child. Thereby, through this system of marriage politics, the Fujiwara kept all of the power, whereas the imperial family was still the imperial family. This starts a tradition in Japanese history of various people pseudo-usurping power from the emperor while keeping them literally in place. So the emperor is still the emperor, but generally Japanese emperors, there's very few periods in Japanese history where the emperor has lots of power. Almost always the power is held by someone else. Over time, a group called the Daimyo rose to power. The daimyo were large, wealthy landowners. Japan is very mountainous and difficult to travel around, and so because of this, in order to organize and to make sure enough food is produced, you need to have a very ordered social structure to build the terraces, to get the irrigation to produce rice, things like that. Because this was very labor-intensive, over time wealthy landowners were able to increase their power and increase their territory, eventually establishing these domains that you see in this map here, with each of these families controlling a significant amount of territory. In order to administer their territory, the daimyos then gave individual plots of land and estates to their followers, known as the samurai. This is a system that works sort of similar to European feudalism, although there are clearly some differences. The samurai were mounted warriors expected to be able to come to the daimyo's aid in battle, but they were also administrators who would carry out and sort of rule and make sure that the people on the daimyo's estate were being productive and were providing the daimyo with the income. Generally, daimyo wealth is calculated in bushels of rice, a unit known as koku. And so making sure that the daimyo would get all of his incomes from these lands, and then showing up to fight when it was necessary. Over time, the Japanese developed this system called Bushido, or the way of the warrior. Similar to European chivalry, it has a series of values that every Japanese person is supposed to embody. And by embodying and living through these sort of values, they get honor and accumulate prestige. And so stuff like integrity, respect, courage, compassion, and specifically loyalty. Absolute loyalty was expected, and one of the ways to restore honor was to, if you had an honor conflict, one of the ways to restore honor to your family was through ritual suicide, known as seppuku, where a Japanese warrior would, to show his devotion to his lord and to his own honor, would cut open his belly and then have his head chopped off. This was seen as a preferable to living a dishonored life. And of course, because the Japanese at this point had believed in Buddhism, if you kill yourself in this honorable, appropriate way, it increases your opportunity to be reborn and to move sort of up the hierarchy of life. Samurai would often then also compose death poems, which we see one of here, that also contain elements of Mujo and Mono no Oware. And so we see all of these different philosophies getting blended together within Japanese society in the values held by the samurai. We also see this comfortability with death in a lot of samurai guidebooks. This is a Tokugawa-era book called the Hagakure, that lays out this whole thing, this whole philosophy. Quote, meditation on inevitable death should be performed daily. Every day when one's body and mind are at peace, one should meditate upon being ripped apart by arrows, rifles, spears, and swords, being carried away by surging waves, being thrown into the midst of a great fire and being struck by lightning, being shaken to death by a great earthquake, falling from 1,000-foot cliffs, dying of disease, or committing seppuku at the death of one's master. And every day without fail, one should consider himself as dead. And so, because, of course, they believe in reincarnation, death was not seen as the end of life, but just a stage within your life journey, because, of course, your spirit will be reborn. And so living life correctly and dying well is much more important than just living for as long as possible. All of this Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism, became very popular in Japan. There were other types of Buddhism, of course, specifically Pure Land Amida Buddhism was another one. In that version of Buddhism, the Buddha acts almost as a Christ-like savior. But Zen Buddhism was specifically the Buddhism of the samurai. We see this. You can see this in movies about samurai, like like the Tom Cruise vehicle, The Last Samurai, where Tom Cruise learns that by clearing your mind, by forming an emptiness, you can react more quickly. And so this sort of blank meditation becomes part of samurai culture as well, and also assists them in their becoming great warriors. Eventually, over time, these daimyo became increasingly powerful, and these daimyo families, of course, fought each other for control. Eventually, a family called the Minamoto family was able to seize control of most of central Japan by fighting a series of battles and taking over significant territory. The Minamoto family then the head of the Minamoto family then declared himself shogun, which is the military ruler of Japan. The shogun did not become emperor. There was still an emperor in place, of course, and there was still a regent over the imperial family. But the actual decisions were now being made by the shogunate, and the samurai were in charge. Over time, a family called the Hojo family then was able to keep the shoguns relatively young by marrying their daughters in, similar to the way the Fujiwara took over the imperial family. And then you had a regency over the shogun, who's actually ruling, but there's still an emperor and regent off in Kyoto doing their things, mostly Shinto rituals and stuff. So Japanese rulership has always been super complicated, and the lines of exactly who has power have never been totally clear. And so keep in mind, this is going to be a trend that's going to happen for, almost all of Japanese history. Eventually, the Minamoto family was overthrown and disrupted from power by an emperor named Go-Daigo, who tried to seize control and rule for himself. He was only able to do this for a few years before a family called the Ashikaga family then seized power and established a new shogunate. But for the most part, the Ashikaga family never had the actual influence to rule much beyond their territory, and so each individual daimyo was able to mostly do what they wanted to do. Eventually, war between these competing daimyo, known as the Onin War, disrupted the even nominal power of the Ashikaga. During this time period, you started seeing new weapons showing up, specifically firearms coming in from the Middle East and from Europe, and you started seeing large-scale battles between different samurai clans and different daimyo. This time period was known as the Sengoku, and it would last for about 150 years of Japanese history, with no actual clan controlling Japan, and the entire country being divided between different warring groups. It's also sometimes known as the Warring States period, similar to the periods of disunity in China, with each daimyo dreaming that he could one day unify Japan and become the shogun. So that's the briefest explanation of Japanese history, Japanese culture, and some background before we get into the three great unifiers that lead us into the Tokugawa period, which is a period of stability in Japanese history for about 200 years. Thank you for listening.